Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities. With me is my co-host, Zama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. M&M Legal is a boutique commercial law firm which aims to be a primary advisor to small and medium enterprises, as well as an advisor to individuals on an array of private law matters. How are you doing today, Smoo?
No, I'm fine. Thank you, Sia. How are things that side?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. And today we've got a very special surprise for our listeners. We're joined by a new co-host who joins the Ubuntunomics team, Zama Matungandaba. Zama, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. And you, Sia?
I'm very well, thank you. And welcome to Ubuntunomics podcast.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, welcome, Zama. Welcome.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Spoo.
All right, guys, let's get started. Our first story in the SA update is SA plans to regulate crypto assets. The initial South African public statement on crypto assets was issued by the National Treasury in 2014 as a joint initiative with the South African Reserve Bank, the SARB, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, the FSCA, which was formerly the Financial Services Board, and the South African Revenue Services SARS and the Financial Intelligence Center, FIC. The statement warned the public about risks associated with the use of crypto assets for the purpose of transacting or investing, and advised users to apply personal caution. The national position that crypto assets are largely unregulated and that public engage in crypto-related activities at their own risk and without any regulatory recourse has been revised to regulate crypto assets in a phased and structured manner. The new position paper on crypto assets provides a roadmap for establishing a regulatory framework through the regulation of South African crypto asset service providers, CASPs, for anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism purposes.
This is very interesting, Sia. I think it's a very important development for South Africa. With, when it comes to crypto assets, I think a lot of countries are still trying to decide, do we regulate, do we not regulate, or do we not just do anything? So South Africa coming to the decision that it wants to regulate is already a really good step. And, in my opinion, I just think that it's something that needs to be done really carefully, really slowly. And, because this piece of legislation could definitely be riddled with a lot of amendments, because the world of crypto assets is ever changing and it is growing and it is fairly new and it is generally something that has, is unregulated and has been created for that very purpose. So to regulate that is definitely, terrain that needs to be handled carefully. And I think the government may have to look at, updating the Electronic Communications Transactions Act, the Promotion of Personal Information Act, POPI, and the most recent cybercrimes bill or cybercrimes act that it's enacted. They would probably need to accommodate crypto. So, other countries have already started looking at crypto assets as legal tender. So it would be important that South Africa does take a position to make crypto trading more secure and less risky in South Africa. So I think it is a good move for South Africa. But I do think that the banks are generally bound not to like the whole development of cryptocurrency, because, in essence, crypto assets would be taking away the centralized power of banks. So there also needs to be careful consideration of the politics surrounding the formulation of this legislation.
I remember back in 2017, the South African Reserve Bank viewing these cryptocurrencies as ordinary value storage assets. I wonder, what is it that has led to the revision? Is it growth in the use of these assets? Or does the international acceptance and growth in the size of these asset of the asset class also contribute to the change in strategy from the South African Reserve Bank, you think?
So I think it's a combination of these things. The one, I think, is the proliferation of crypto assets in terms of the introduction of new coins. We're now sitting with over thousands of digicoins in terms of cryptocurrency coins that are now in existence and can be traded electronically, globally, etc. And on the other hand, we've seen a significant volatility, at least over the last, I would say, 3 months, in terms of Bitcoin, which has basically crashed from about where it was trading at around 900,000 rands per Bitcoin, to where it is now between 500 to 550,000 rand per Bitcoin. And I think what the financial regulators have seen is obviously a significant shedding in value, but also the volatility and high risk of these assets, which has significantly changed the way in which regulators are viewing crypto assets. So for me, it seems, it's a combination of the expansion in the use and adoption of cryptocurrency, as well as the rise in inherent risk. Also, given the fact that cryptocurrencies now seem to be very linked to the tweeting, hands of one Elon Musk. If you've been watching the markets, one statement that he makes in terms of his company Tesla and whether they're going to adopt or accept cryptocurrencies for payments for vehicles, on the one hand, has lifted the value of Bitcoin. But when he decided against this decision, and for his own personal reasons, and I think he's also been taking advantage of the market and his influence in the market, has actually exposed the fact that what most people have assumed are very stable assets at the time at which crypto assets were becoming more popular, to a view that actually these assets are very volatile to sentiment, which I think for me points to two things. One, that a lot of people are actually using crypto assets for value storing rather than actual transacting, and hence the volatility in terms of sentiment. Otherwise, if sentiment didn't matter and people were using crypto assets for transacting purely, then it didn't matter what statements Elon Musk has in terms of the actual value of cryptocurrency. So I think it is a combination of their further adoption, but also an increase in volatility that has led to how they're rated.
Yeah, I understand the need for this regulation, but I think whilst there is a need to protect investors, we have to be cautious not to kill future innovations in this crypto space. We have to open up a window for experimentation. For starters, we have to correctly classify these assets, whether we are talking about tradable assets like your Bitcoins and the Ethereums, or whether we're talking about digital tokens, which are usually privately owned, and they are touted to be the next big thing. I mean, in trading stocks in the stock markets, and in investing in assets like properties. So even though there is market manipulation, like you said about Elon Musk, we should tread carefully and at the same time make general population aware about the risks and underlying asset performance issues and things like scammers. There's a lot of scammers out there. Now you'd see a seemingly legit business or an enterprise, and it turns out to be scammers. Just recently, this current week, President Biden had talks with Putin around claims that Russians are playing in are big players in cyber crimes. Yeah, there's a lot of nuances. Things like ISIL, the group ISIL. How do they move their money around? How do they move their money around from the Sahel to Central African Republic to Mozambique? So even though there are negatives, there are also positives. Like I was saying, we have to open up a window for experimentation. So it's a tricky one, you know.
I definitely agree with you. I think the role in which crypto assets are playing, particularly in the banking of the unbanked, as well as the ease of being able to transact without necessarily having to comply with FICA requirements and all of these restrictive, I think, financial legislation, although is very useful in terms of combating money laundering as well as financing of terrorism, it's also very restrictive, right? So I do agree that we have to, not stifle the innovation that crypto assets actually present. But for me, I have a fundamental question about whether or not crypto assets can actually be regulated. Because if you think of the way in which the general ledger system operates and how it's actually structured, and this is what Zama was pointing to earlier, to provide anonymity and privacy, is that you have to wonder, is it actually possible? Because this is not actually the same function or way in which general legal tender operates, right? Through a centralized ledger, central banks, and which banks also feed into through the reserve requirements, etc. The generalized ledger system sits on various computers, very difficult to trace, and was structured precisely to provide that anonymity. And I wonder whether this attempt to regulate crypto assets is actually going to be effective in delivering the kind of tools that we need to fight money laundering and financing of terrorism, and whether or not the regulatory environment is actually incompatible with the way in which crypto assets actually operate and are structured. But I think this legislation develops, we will have to deal with it more in future. But it seems as though at this point, I'm unclear as to whether we're going to have a national bill on crypto assets or whether we're going to have smaller regulations run by the ecosystem of financial institutions, such as the Reserve Bank and the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, in their requirements on compliance on the part of banks and other crypto asset service providers, which in many instances do still operate within the purview and the restrictions of legislation such as FICA requirement. Here I'm talking about crypto asset service providers like Luno, who, for example, when you're setting up your account, will still require all the FICA requirements and will still need to be compliant in terms of a tax point of view, whilst also allowing people to store some value in crypto assets. So it's almost as if a new ecosystem, which is sitting in between the current legal tender system and the general ledger system of crypto assets, is actually what the South African financial sector authorities are trying to regulate rather than actual crypto assets themselves.
Delve into things like digital currencies by central banks, like the Bank of China issuing their own, or South Africa issuing its own. Yeah.
Which is the way in which other governments have been dealing with this conundrum, the dilemma that you do want to regulate these crypto assets, but the way in which they function actually is impossible to regulate. And so countries like China have banned Bitcoin and other crypto assets and have actually instituted their own cryptocurrencies, which they then regulate based on their framework and how they've structured their ledger system to be operating within the financial system. There was a time at which the South African Reserve Bank was contemplating issuing its own cryptocurrency, its own coin, in conjunction with, I think it was Goldman Sachs, if I'm not mistaken. But it seems as though that idea has sort of fallen on the wayside, or hasn't really become public or mainstream as yet. Moving right along, the next story is South Africa participates in the G7 Leaders Summit. President Cyril Ramaphosa attended the G7 Leaders Summit in Cornwall, United Kingdom, at the invitation of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. South Africa was invited for its role as the co-chair of the Access to COVID-19 Tools, the ACT Accelerator Facilitation Council, which aims to expedite research, manufacturing, and equitable distribution of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics across the world. Since its formation a year ago, the ACT Accelerator has supported more than 70 countries to expand lab infrastructure for testing, delivered millions of rapid diagnostic tests, accelerated development and production of vaccines, delivered more than 69 million vaccine doses, and procured more than 500 million in personal protective equipment. President Ramaphosa called on all G7 members to support the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS waiver, at the World Trade Organization in order to massively and rapidly expand vaccine production in Africa and across developing and least developed countries in the world.
What are your thoughts about the success of this plea? I put this in, and I want to underline the word plea, seeing that the EU is reluctant to waive IP rights, and at the same time, the US sounds like they are open to this plea by the developing world. What are your thoughts?
Sure. But I think the EU has come around, at least slightly, to align with the US or the TRIPS waiver requests generally. However, they do still disagree on how this will be implemented. And if we look at the statements by the United States, they seem to be backtracking on what there was an initial blanket support and saying that rather the US, in addition to supporting, will actually provide over 2 million, or is it, 2 million or 2 billion doses for developing countries. 2 billion doses for developing countries. And it seems as though still the conundrum of profit over, mainstreaming of vaccines is still something that countries have not been able to deal with. But some people have actually criticized President Ramaphosa for actually being engaged in some kind of political grandstanding, in that, if developing countries really wanted to produce the vaccines, they could take the approach that China normally takes in terms of intellectual property, which is, ask for forgiveness later. And I think in the context of, pandemic and the fact that this pandemic cannot be overcome unless every country has access, equitable access at least, through vaccines in order to enable some level of herd immunity, there is no solution that is going to be delivered from a top-down approach. We just simply need to have equitable access. And so it seems as though all kinds of political and moral objections would be on the side of developing countries. And also, if you look at the balance in terms of the number of countries that support the vaccine production in developing countries, they clearly have a majority in terms of global support. So on the one hand, some people are actually questioning whether or not this is just a political grandstanding of South Africa and India trying to be approved or seem as though they're the darlings to the West. At the same time, we could have been producing the Sputnik vaccines, right? Because Russia has provided its intellectual property for free and has actually helped a number of countries in establishing or at least ramping up their productive capacity in producing the Sputnik vaccine. But again, that vaccine, apart from questions on its effectiveness, seems to have developed in a very short time and has overlooked what some have seen as the thorough or right way to develop vaccines, and it may be shrouded in some controversy. But it seems to me that whether or not the developed countries do support the TRIPS waiver, the fact is that there's still going to be a lead time of, I think, 18 to 20 months in which the developing countries where these vaccines are going to be produced are still going to be ramping up their productive capacity, still looking for foreign direct investment in order to establish local productive, so it isn't as though by gaining the support through these pleas, we'll automatically then be able to put online our production in the developed world. But what are your thoughts on this, Zama?
So I think you've sort of touched on some of my thoughts on it, but my thinking was, do you especially from the perspective of production, do you think that we're in a space as this developing economies to be able to produce this vaccine of their own accord? So do you think and do you believe that it would be more efficient for the developing economies to produce these vaccines themselves, as opposed to sort of fostering all these sort of other negotiations, particularly considering the impact that COVID-19 and lockdown, various lockdown measures have had on South Africa's economy? Do you think that this is something that would be more efficient if this was something we had to do, as in pick up the production ourselves?
Definitely. Look, if the experience of India, for example, which was producing the COVAX for a lot of the developing world before they fell into their own domestic crisis and couldn't produce the volumes needed for the global demand, whilst also dealing with their national crises, it was quite clear that we do need to have a significant proliferation in terms of where these vaccines are being produced. And on the other hand, it doesn't seem as though the TRIPS waiver approach is going to lead to every developing country having productive capacity, or at least some capacity to produce these vaccines locally. There seems to be a number of few countries, so-called regional hubs, which have been identified for their capacity to produce locally and their industrial capacity as an economy. Some, such as Egypt, Algeria, and South Africa, as well as Senegal, in terms of, or is it Sierra Leone? I'm not sure between the two, Senegal or Sierra Leone, but the point is, it's not as though every African country is going to have productive capacity to produce their vaccines locally. And so, one thing for sure, though, it will deal with the problem of concentration, in that what we've seen since India fell through its own national crisis, that a lot of the developing countries couldn't actually access any of their vaccines. In fact, countries like Madagascar, for example, have been suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic for a while now, were only able to receive their first batches of the vaccines last week or 2 weeks ago. I mean, this is after countries like the United Kingdom have already vaccinated a majority of their populations and are actually at a phase of considering reducing the restrictions on the lockdown. So the fact of the matter is that by increasing the proliferation of global production of these vaccines, we will be dealing with the great divergence, because right now we're seeing a great divergence in that developed countries have hoarded the vaccines. Some of them are not actually using all of the quantities they've ordered, mainly due to vaccine skepticism, etc. And on the other hand, the developing countries and least developed countries have not even accessed, there are countries who haven't even received their first doses. So it is a significant challenge, which I think the TRIPS waiver could definitely ease the pressures and deal with the great divergence to some extent.
The TRIPS waiver, I think, is a more urgent intervention. Getting back to the G7 Leaders Summit in Cornwall, campaigners have said that the G7 is too slow. If you're talking about manufacturing will take some time to sort out. Campaigners have been saying the G7 are too slow and they lack the ambition required to vigorously tackle this pandemic. The UK have been the ones that have been saying that some countries are using this this vaccine story to exert influence on developing countries. And let me correct you this year. I think I read that the US had pledged 500 million doses, and the UK had pledged 100. Canada might come in at 100 million doses. So one can see that the EU is more concerned with their interest. Some critics saying that Western countries have failed to grasp the exceptional effort needed. Even former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown likened the G7 pledges to passing around the begging bowl, because they're just passing it around. Then no one is committing, because Oxfam has said that the world needs 11 billion doses. 11 billion. So if you add together these pledges, they don't even come up to 1 billion doses. So and 3.9 million people have already died. So the pledges are just a tiny fraction of what is needed.
Definitely. I mean, what you've already counted in terms of, I think, around 700 million doses doesn't even cover, the continent of Africa's requirement. And then on the other side of this is that even if we are able to produce and deliver the numbers of the vaccines required, there's still some countries which are war-torn and have conflict, which obviously makes it difficult to distribute and have equitable access to the vaccines around all developing countries. But again, this is a story that's going to be continuing and unfolding, and we'll definitely not cover everything today. Moving along, the next story for today is laws on vaccinations in the workplace. Minister of Employment and Labour, S01E10, gazetted new consolidated occupational health and safety directions for certain workplaces. The consolidated occupational health and safety directions balances public health imperatives, the constitutional right of employees to refuse being vaccinated for medical and constitutional grounds, and the efficient operation of employers' business. Employers are required to conduct a risk assessment if it intends to make vaccinations compulsory and identify which of its employees will be affected. In determining whether an employee can be required to be vaccinated, the employer must identify those employees whose work poses a risk of transmission or a risk of severe COVID-19 disease or death due to their age or comorbidities. An employer may only make vaccinations an obligation once the employee becomes eligible under the National Program for Vaccination, has been registered on the electronic vaccination data system, and is given a date for the vaccination.
Okay, Sia, this to me makes sense, but the question arises when there is a conflict between the employer and the employee. So if an employee really does not want to take the vaccine, these conflicts or tensions may lead to other labor-related issues such as disciplinary hearings or, even the CCMA. Thus, making vaccines compulsory, I think, just needs to be handled with care, because we need to balance the individual's personal constitutional rights with, what the employer wants. However, if the minister provides guidelines on how the vaccines may be made compulsory, then, it can assist in avoiding a case-by-case sort of issue, because all companies would have essentially used the same framework to determine the compulsory taking of vaccines, right? In general, however, I think employers, should drive to make employees aware of the downsides and risks of not taking the vaccines, particularly the risk of infecting others. I think if these risks and downsides are highlighted, employees will feel more at liberty to take the vaccine. It shouldn't be forced on employees without proper explanation and motivation? And further, should it be such that an employee needs to vaccinate by the time that we need to pay for the vaccination? I think, it should be the employer who actually pays for that. So that's just my comment on that.
Sure.
I get the feeling that this is going to be one of those policy gray areas. As Zama is saying, it sounds like the employers will be given carte blanche right to determine who gets vaccinated, and they will exercise rights as they see fit. That's my 2 cents on this topic.
So, look, I definitely think that one of the key issues is that in South Africa, we still have very adversarial corporate relations between laborers, workers, and actual capital owners or, managers. In that managers rarely actually want to take the rights of workers into account. I mean, you name it, whether it's the agricultural mining sector, for example, South African corporate relations are so toxic that people have actually been killed, for the purposes of balancing the interest between workers and employers. So I think that for me, it is an unbalanced, bargaining power between the two, and the toxic relationships are actually going to be what makes it difficult. I do think that these directions are a step in the right in the right approach, but I think government in itself and how it's dealing with healthcare workers has already failed. And hence, we've seen a delay, for example, in the rollout of the vaccine program for health workers, which wasn't concluded by the time we started rolling out the vaccines to elderly and those with comorbidities. And I agree with you, it's going to continue being that gray area. And it's precisely because of these kind of corporate relations, but also the loopholes which the legal system inherently creates, which will make it difficult for us to actually balance all the sides that need to be balanced. I think moving right along to the last story for the South Africa update this week, which is linked to the COVID issue, South Africa responds to the COVID-19 third wave. President Cyril Ramaphosa moved South Africa to alert level 3 in response to rising COVID-19 infections. Over the last 7 days, daily infections have more than doubled to an average of 7,500 daily infections. Meanwhile, hospital admissions have increased by 59%, and daily COVID-19 mortalities have increased by 48% to 791 over the past 2 weeks. As a result, the daily curfew has been extended to start at 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Non-essential business establishments are required to close at 9 p.m., and all gatherings have been limited to a maximum of 50 people indoors and 100 people outdoors. And the sale of alcohol from retail outlets has been restricted to 10 a.m. From 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. from Monday to Thursday.
I heard today that there are fears that Gauteng hospitals, the province of Gauteng, may be clogged in the weeks to come. That the measures, these level 3 measures, which were announced yesterday, fall short of solving, of addressing the pandemic, the crisis, basically.
Sure. And I think if you compare these adjusted level 3 to where we were in the original level 3 legislation, COVID-19 regulations, you'll see that there's a very huge stark contrast. And actually, people have been calling for a hard lockdown, albeit for a short period, a limited period, in order to shock people back into that mode that we were all in at the beginning of the pandemic, where we were all careful and actually compliant, because it seems as though government, apart from dealing with the actual challenges with dealing with the infections, their major challenge that they're faced with is actually dealing with compliance. And the fact that there seems to be a fatigue on South Africans in terms of complying with the regulations from a social distancing and a masking point of view. But I definitely agree with you. I don't see how these legislations are actually going to take us out to actually resolve the problem, particularly given the slow rollout we have from a vaccine point of view. What are your thoughts on this, Mama?
Yes, I completely agree with whether the regulations will be sufficient, and whether they do prove what we will need essentially for this third wave. But I agree as well that it essentially is up to us as individuals and as people living in this country. We really need to fight the good fight. And I think that South Africans have sort of, we get into this phase where we get a lockdown and then we're very serious and we all want a social distance and we all take very good care. And then the moment they ease restrictions, I think we let go of ourselves. So I think it's very important that we need to remember to social distance, sanitize, wear our face masks, avoid touching your face, your eyes, open windows. Do not spend time in an enclosed space with people you don't know. Only go out if it's really necessary. When you're out, observe your protocols. We need to regulate ourselves, because COVID is real. So there's only so much that the government can do. They are pumping us with this information, but we need to regulate ourselves. And remember that every time we step outside of the house, we're taking a risk with your life, which is further enhanced when you do not adhere to COVID protocols. So we really need to take responsibility to say it's not just the government giving us vaccines, but it's the little actions that we take on a day-to-day basis in preventing the spread of COVID. And we should not forget. Yeah.
Mm.
I totally agree with you that the solution is at a micro level, but we have to also have a very organized government in the rollout. And the other thing is the bickering that we're now going to face from an industry point of view on the unfair application of alcohol sales restriction between retail outlets versus consumption on site outlets is definitely going to be focusing on a sideshow or issues that are actually irrelevant. At the end of the day, we are faced with a third wave, and we are entering the depths of winter right now, which will make matters much, much, much worse. But the issue of trying to enforce a micro level intervention is almost impossible at this point without, I think, government's clear direction and enforcing compliance.
I'll tell you what is interesting. Then this current wave is regional. It's Gauteng. It's all the central provinces: Gauteng, the Northern Cape, Free State, and a bit in KwaZulu Natal. I don't know what the reason what the reasons for that are, but it's just quite interesting to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Okay, on that note, that ends the essay update for this week. Our first story for the Rest of Africa update this week is violence continues in Mozambique. Civilians continue fleeing armed conflict and insecurity in Cabo Delgado province in northern Mozambique, months after militants attacked the coastal city of Palma. Some 70,000 people have fled the city since 24 March 2021, which brings the overall number of displaced people to nearly 800,000, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. People have been escaping daily for districts further south or to neighboring countries such as Tanzania. And thousands more have been reported to be stranded in areas with restricted humanitarian access around Palma city.
There was a lull in hostilities, wasn't there? What has the government of Mozambique been doing since they last sent the army to rescue foreigners from the city of Palma? And my second question would be, when is SADC intervening? Do we have clear details?
Sure. Look, you remember that last month we reported on the SADC mission, which was supposed to give feedback to the SADC summit on the 28th of May. And since then, there's been a report, obviously, of the state of conflict. And then since then, we've also seen the force majeure and the evacuation of all the Total employees from Cabo Delgado. There hasn't been much movement, really. The government of Mozambique seems to be quite reluctant to accept external assistance. as you can imagine, due to historic reasons, obviously.
Mhm.
And although the last kind of assistance that was offered was from the French President Emmanuel Macron in his deliberations with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa during his working visit, there wasn't any further engagement directly with the government of Mozambique. And the government of Mozambique seems to be currently dealing with the crisis internally. The SADC region hasn't made any further deliberations or decisions since then. My understanding, though, is that the SADC summit was waiting for a list of assistance or required assistance from the government of Mozambique in order to then begin the process of mobilizing that support for the government of Mozambique. However, at this point, there hasn't seemed to have been much change or movement since. And I think the other challenge is that these moments of lull are really the critical moments in conflicts like Cabo Delgado, because it's during the time at which refugees are escaping the conflict at what might be seemingly a calm period that some of the belligerent or insurgents might be disguising themselves as refugees, moving across into neighboring countries such as Tanzania, South Africa, etc., and perhaps even establishing equal movements in these neighboring countries. And so it's really the crucial time that countries need to be vigilant during these so-called quiet times, because apart from the internally displaced people, really the movement of these refugees is the time at which the belligerents will take advantage and disguise themselves in order to spread. And soon you've got a situation such as what we have in West Africa with Boko Haram, and that time passes by, and a minute later it's a decade and the girls have not been delivered, and now the conflict is spread to neighboring countries, and it has become a fully fledged regional insurgency. And I think it's precisely what I'm most concerned about in the case of the Mozambican conflict and its impact on the SADC region.
Precisely my thoughts on this, which was really, what about SADC and regional integration? What is the region as a whole doing to fix what is going on? What are other countries doing to fix what is going on? And it's been going on for a long time, as you guys have highlighted, and I just feel as though we as humanity have made such big efforts on terrorism and human rights laws for this to still be going on. It just leads me to think, okay, what is the agenda behind this conflict that has been going on now for over 3 years already?
Yeah.
And since 2017, and has basically displaced over 724,000 people, basically almost 1 million people have been displaced from their homes. And we speak of regional integration, we speak of free trade agreement, but how can we expect to improve trade lines, unify on policies, come together as one Africa, if we can't even assist each other on security issues?
Sure.
So the United Nations is calling on Tanzania to allow refugees from Mozambique to be given asylum, as most had been fleeing to Tanzania, but many have also been turned back. So the question for me is this a Mozambique issue or is this an Africa issue? Because as much as there's organizations like the United Nations, do we not have to hold ourselves accountable as countries in our sovereignty?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you on everything you've mentioned, really, because without an adequate local response, and it is going to affect the countries in the region effectively. And so we shouldn't be waiting until the United Nations Security Council issues a mission on Mozambique. We should have our own regional mission there. And the other challenge, I think, is that the way in which countries are viewing the conflict and responding to it has been primarily from a military point of view, given the violence and the fact that it is an armed violence and the number of deaths that have resulted from this. But ultimately, you're also dealing with close to 1 million people who are facing a humanitarian crisis. Cabo Delgado being one of the poorest provinces in Mozambique means that the people who are now displaced have reached rock bottom. These were already people who were struggling with challenges such as poverty, etc. And the conflict really comes in as the sort of last straw to break that camel's back. And countries like Tanzania seem to be sort of, in a way, annexed by refugees. A couple of weeks back, Sbu, you might remember
Yeah.
us reporting on
Yeah.
Burundi refugees who were ill-treated in Tanzania, in terms of them being persecuted and being investigated by special security forces and being targets of political indictments, etc. And that's just from its neighbors within the East African community. And now from the south comes the refugees from Cabo Delgado. And from point of view of Tanzania, because it's almost difficult to differentiate between real, refugees who are suffering from the violence, etc., and those insurgents who are disguising themselves amongst the refugees, the best strategy that they have is to send people back. But ultimately, this is also fueling a continuation of that violence without actually neighboring countries having an adequate regional response. There's actually no way forward to resolve this conflict.
Yeah.
Anyway, another
Yeah.
case similar to this is the DRC, which is our next story. The East African community deploys the DRC verification mission. The East African Community EAC deployed a verification mission to the Democratic Republic of Congo to assess the country's suitability to be admitted into the regional economic community. The EAC appointed a verification team comprised of 3 experts from each partner state to be funded by the EAC Secretariat, and additional maximum of 2 experts to be funded by the nominating party state to carry out the verification mission from 23 June 2021 until 3 July 2021. The summit of EAC heads of state considered the application by the DRC to join the community and directed the council to expeditiously undertake a verification mission in accordance with the EAC procedures for admission of new members during the 21st ordinary meeting held on 27 February 2021. The verification team will, among other things, review the current status of the DRC in international law and establish the country's level of conformity with the criteria for admission for foreign countries as provided by the EAC treaties.
The DRC is part of SADC. Tanzania is also part of SADC. At the same time, they are part of the EAC. So now, what is the general rule about these communities in terms of joining 2 or more regional blocks? And my second question, a follow-up question, is: could a conflict of interest not arise wherein the 2 communities interpret a particular issue differently? And so you would have SADC and the EAC. What won't these countries be straddling? What's the general rule basically?
So there is no general rule, and this is one of the biggest critiques of the Africa regional integration process, in that the people have called it the spaghetti bowl of regional integration, meaning countries are multiple member regional economic communities, and they play off benefits from one versus obligations in another, etc. For example, countries like Eswatini are members to the SACU, Southern African Customs Union, SADC, and as well as COMESA. And they use various benefits in these various regional economic communities to benefit themselves effectively. So, for example, under COMESA, the Eswatini doesn't have any reciprocal requirements because it's under a special derogation as a small country, as a low-income country. And whilst it's a member of the SACU, it also benefits from the common revenue pool for its own fiscus. And so countries generally join multiple regional economic communities in order to balance their obligations and benefits and effectively basically pursue their national interest. And at the same time, this also makes it difficult to consolidate the process of regional integration. You'll remember, Sbu, that last week we covered the meeting of the tripartite free trade area agreement, which tries to consolidate SADC, the East African Community, as well as COMESA, as one of the critical stepping stones in the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And really what we're trying to do with the tripartite is consolidate all these multiple memberships because, for example, at the World Trade Organization and the GATT requires countries to be a member of only one customs union. And if, for example, Eswatini cannot join the East African Community whilst also being a member of the SADC Customs Union, at the point at which the EAC becomes a customs union, which means that it has to choose one of these. But from a regional economic community point of view, as free trade area, this does create complications and it does create an issue around the harmonization of policies as well, because each regional economic community has got its own agenda. The East African Community has its own, for example, regional infrastructure master plan. Same thing as SADC. So it becomes difficult then to balance as to which of these plans and master plans is a country implementing and what's the actual final outcome. But at the same time, in this case of the DRC, for me, it does present a bit of a conundrum, right? Because for one, the conflicts in the DRC involve ostensibly more of the East African Community member states. If you think of the North and South Kivu impact of Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi, who are the three primary countries which have created a contagion impact of their security challenges moving over into the DRC in an area in which the Democratic Republic of Congo government has got limited access in terms of being able to control and resolve that conflict. And so in the SADC, the DRC doesn't have a full membership in that it's also not part of the free trade area. So for me, it seems as though an adequate resolution of the DRC's political conflicts will only come from it sitting around the same table with its East African Community member states. Yes, the DRC is part of the conference on the Conference of the Great Lakes Region, the ICLGR, where it sits with Rwanda, Burundi, etc. But the challenge in that grouping is that there are too many member states who are facing the conflicts in the region and different kinds of conflicts to such an extent that the DRC is not a priority. For example, there's the Central African Republic, which is part of the Great Lakes Region Conference. And so the Great Lakes Region agenda is already overloaded with multiple conflicts. And it's only through the East African Community where the DRC's conflicts will be adequately resolved, because countries such as Burundi and Rwanda and Uganda are relatively stable as a result of some of the requirements within the East African Community. And if you look at the solution of the conflict in Burundi, a large part in resolving this conflict has been played by the East African Community, from its requirements on political stability as well as its interventions within Burundi, which has led to a relative stability in Burundi. And so I do think the DRC conflicts will be adequately or can be adequately resolved through the East African Community. But I do think that, adding another membership to the DRC's multiple memberships already does create, contradictions in the process of regional integration. Our next story from the Rest of Africa update is the LCG returns migrants and refugees. Over 270 migrants and refugees were handed over to the Libyan Coast Guard by a ship, Vos Triton, sailing under the flag Gibraltar. The group was rescued in international waters during their attempt to reach Europe on 14 June 2021. The LCG, the Libyan Coast Guard, returned them to the main port of Tripoli, where they were taken into detention by Libyan authorities. The International Organization for Migration and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, have condemned the return of migrants and refugees to Libya because, under international maritime law, rescued individuals should be disembarked at a place of safety. The LCG has returned more than 13,000 people to Libya this year, already surpassing the number of people intercepted or rescued and disembarked in all of 2020. The IOM and the UNHCR have called on states to coordinate so that merchant vessels rescuing people in distress are granted swift permission for disembarking in a place of safety to avoid refugees and migrants being placed at risk.
Yeah. I think this, points to the fact that refugees are quite a sensitive topic, as you guys have sort of highlighted, as we've highlighted earlier in the conversation. Not only due to the fact that the host country takes on extra economic pressures of sustaining the refugees, but also because of other points which you've mentioned regarding safety of, certain, people that could cause problems actually posing as refugees. But in this instance, people are fleeing for their lives from Libya, and Libya is not considered safe. So it for me, I think it shows again kind of what we've also highlighted a bit earlier, the politics of Europe and these other countries who are not making it any easier for the refugees to find peace. My thinking is, if you're fleeing from an unsafe place, you shouldn't be taken back to that unsafe place. So it's questionable as to how people fleeing are then returned back to Libya.
Yeah, yeah. And if you might have been tracking some of these news in the region generally, there's also been a collusion between some of the European states as well as some of the North African states, such as Morocco, for example, where
Yeah.
there's been a sort of no man's land, or a land which is owned currently by Spanish authorities, where actually it is precisely just being used to capture those trying to flee conflict
Yes.
in the Maghreb region, trying to access Europe and other areas of safety. Well, for all intents and purposes, this strip of land is actually part of Morocco. But for political reasons and other, this piece of land in Morocco is actually under the administration of Spain, and basically it's just a stretch of beach which Spaniards exploit during the summer. But for Moroccans and other citizens from the Maghreb region, it's actually just a no man's land where they're actually being persecuted. Really,
Mm.
the issue of conflict on the continent is creating a serious challenge, precisely through the movement of people and displacement of people internally and as refugees across the continent. And I think this is one of the consequences of the conflict that we will never really be able to resolve, even after us having resolved a lot of the conflicts that are taking place on the continent. But
Sure.
moving right along. The next story from the Africa Regional Update is the AU Commission of Inquiry on the Tigray region. The African Union officially launched the Commission of Inquiry on the Tigray region in the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which will commence its work on the 17th of June 2021. The Commission of Inquiry has a mandate to, among other things, investigate allegations of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and to gather all relevant information so as to determine whether the allegations constitute serious or massive violations of human rights. The Commission of Inquiry will sit for an initial period of 3 months, which may be subsequently renewed by the AU.
We've come to accept the AU as being toothless. Now, in this case, matters will be complicated by the fact that the AU is hosted by the Ethiopian government in Addis Ababa, who they plan to investigate. The same AU is planning to investigate Ethiopia. Now, human rights violations have been reported widely, even though the government had instituted a media curfew in the province of Tigray. Now, my first question would be, must we raise our expectations unnecessarily high? Do you see a situation where the AU can come down harshly on the Ethiopian government? And a follow-up would be, there's also the question of the Eritrean troops who were fighting alongside the Ethiopian government forces. They have been reported to have committed the most heinous human rights violations, especially using rape as a weapon of war against Tigray women, how would the AU tackle the rogue, self-isolating Eritrean regime?
Yeah. Yeah, look, you point to some of the complexities of this actual conflict. But I think if the US relations, for example, are anything to go by, it seems as though Ethiopia is turning very quickly from being a darling of international development and the West to being, quite a nightmare, effectively. And we're also seeing an undoing of one of the key political bargains that current Prime Minister Abiy was able to actually achieve in Ethiopia. And this is precisely why he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years back, in that he was able to resolve this age-old conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which led to a reopening of the border, which was closed for a couple of decades due to this conflict. But it seems as though, for me, again, it is a fight between the central government as well as the federal state of Tigray, right? It seems as though the central government of Ethiopia has intervened in that conflict and resolved the conflict before the actual warring parties themselves had actually resolved the conflict. And the mere fact that you've got Eritrean soldiers who are still operating within Tigray, although the government of Eritrea has denied any of these allegations, is a clear illustration for me that the actual warring parties themselves haven't resolved the conflict amongst themselves. Although the central government has come to say, look, we're instituting a ceasefire, we're now actually agreeing to end the conflict and reopen the borders, the actual warring parties have continued having this conflict. Then there's also allegations, obviously, on the other side of a so-called ethnic cleansing that's taken place in Ethiopia, which all points to the complexities now of that conflict. And I'm not certain whether the AU will be able to actually have any lasting impact in its intervention here. And even if you look at the mandate that this Commission of Inquiry has, it seems quite clear that the AU has accepted that there are human rights violations and international humanitarian law violations. It's almost as if they're just going to realize how severe or how bad the situation in the Tigray is. And then obviously the fact that Ethiopia is having its own fight with neighboring countries such as Egypt as well as Sudan, around the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam also then complicates matters, because whilst it's fighting its own sort of civil conflict in the Tigray region, it's also engaged in a sort of huge fight with its neighbors over the issue of the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It seems as though, to me, Ethiopia is headed for some significant conflict which won't only affect the country, but perhaps affects the Horn of Africa region as a whole. And for me, I'm very, very, very concerned at the direction in which things are turning.
Yeah, agreed with you, Sia, particularly because I mean, it's all good and well to have a commission of inquiry and launch a commission of inquiry, but I think what is important ultimately is for the country itself and the government itself to decide on the mechanisms and structures that that will ensure that those violations don't happen or that they're alleviated. So this violence now has been persisting for 6 months, and then decisive action needs to be taken by the government. But the government is part of the unrest, so that creates an issue. The question arises: are they actually doing enough to come to that compromise with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, right? So are they actually doing enough to come to an agreement for peace between them? So that's the government's responsibility, and I think they are part of this unrest, so that creates a problem. And I think further to this, there's also a lot of influence that you briefly mentioned from the US around this, right? So it appears 3 weeks ago, the US stopped issuing visas to Ethiopia's government officials, and Ethiopia reads this as stifling or contributing to the delay of resolving the war. while the US states that it's been trying to assist the two groups, you know, the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, you know, to come to some sort of, you know, common ground. So what do you think about the US involvement and their move to stop giving assistance in certain areas, like pulling their troops from the area and imposing restrictions in other areas? Because, you know, the US is always painted as the bad guy. So do you think it is living up to that in this instance? Or kind of how you briefly made mention of that is, do you think the Ethiopian government is actually the bad guy in this instance, you know?
It's very difficult to tell. I must admit, I don't have a complete understanding of the actual conflict in the Tigray region, and you know, the impact of the involvement of Eritrean forces also, for me, is what further complicates the
Yeah.
matters. But I do think that there is an element of some sort of ethnic violence involved, and it has been a historical issue that from the center and the federal state of the Tigray region have been in conflict for some time. It's not something new. It's an age-old, multi-decade conflict that's been ongoing, obviously with flare-ups here and there.
Okay.
How to resolve the conflict, though, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure whether the way in which the central government of Ethiopia is dealing with it, which is try by all means to squash the impact of the Tigray People's Liberation Front and viewing it as an actual act of civil war against the central government is the way forward in this instance. Obviously, you know, issues around state development in Africa, where balance of powers weren't able to be negotiated, are precisely what led to federal governments being established on the continent. I always thought that this was a particular result of the impact of colonialism and the fictitious borders in which developed through the colonial process. But Ethiopia, being the only African country that wasn't formally colonized, kind of, you know, nullifies my theory to say that, you know, the way in which the colonial borders developed is artificial, and hence we've got fights because people have been separated from families and the authorities and you know, tribal or traditional authorities, and hence this process of state formation resulting in new states such as what we've seen in the case of Sudan and South Sudan. But even there, where the bargains have resulted in the establishment of a new state where people can self-govern, doesn't seem to have actually resolved the conflict. And you know, it's really left me dumbfounded. I don't know. What's your view on this, Mo?
No, I'll tell you what is interesting. The Eritreans in the main speak a language called Tigrinya, and the people of Tigray are also they all speak Tigrinya. So these are brothers, and the way Ethiopia is structured is that all these provinces are similar to South Africa, where you get the Amazulu in KZN and all the ethnic. There's not much mixing of the different ethnic groups in the far-flung provinces. Only in Addis Ababa do you find.
Yeah.
Only in Addis Ababa do you find a mix. So the Tigrinya people are fighting amongst themselves. Basically, the one side being in Eritrea and the others people who are members of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Anyway, in this instance, Eritrea has already dismissed all accusations of impropriety. Even Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has said no civilians were killed. So ethnicity has a lot to play with, has a lot to do with it, and the federal system of Ethiopia. Another interesting point is that back in April, there was a mild statement coming from the group from the G7 foreign ministers and the High Representative of the EU. They simply said, we condemn the killing of civilians, sexual and gender-based violence. And that was it. So how serious will the AU really deal with this matter when the US, as you were saying, built coldish, and the EU is also not so serious? So it's like, let these brothers fight it amongst themselves type of thing. Yeah.
Very, very serious story. On that note, that takes us to our last story for the Rest of Africa update this week. The passing of Dr. Kenneth Kaunda. Ubuntu shares condolences with all Zambians and the family of His Excellency Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of the Republic of Zambia, who died on the 17th of June 2021. Former President Kaunda died after being treated for pneumonia, which has been a recurring problem in his health. It's still unclear what was the exact cause of his death, with some speculating that he may have suffered from COVID-19, which was worsened by the pneumonia. Moving right along to the numbers game this week. The number for this week is 9.8 million rands. Can you guys guess what this number represents? Rama?
9.8 million rand. Very odd number. What could it be? The price of a ministerial house? What is it? I don't know.
I have no idea.
That's a funny one. Well, this is actually the number from the bursaries and learnerships provided by Engine. So 9.8 million rand in learnerships and bursaries. In 2020, Engine invested over 9.8 million in learnerships and bursaries, and they also continued to provide supplementary maths, science, and technology tuition to approximately 1,800 underprivileged grade 10 to grade 12 learners across South Africa through the Engine Maths and Science School program. This week on Youth Day, highlighted one of their graduates from the program, Annelisa from Khayelitsha, who matriculated from Thembelihle Senior Secondary before completing a Bachelor of Technology degree in taxation, cum laude at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Annelisa now works for Engine and is contributing to the running of these learnerships and internship programs, which he himself is a recipient of. And on that note, that ends our stories for this week.